Before we begin, I want to give a birthday shout out to my creative colleague Tyson, another lovely Vile Virgo. I hope you had a fantastic birthday, man. This show may contain adult language and themes. Listener discretion is advised. With that out of the way, let's start the show. You're listening to the Murder is My Sign podcast, the podcast where we talk true crime and astrology. I'm your host, Jordy Death, here to light your way through the true crime astrology storm. Welcome everyone to part 2 of Ed Gein Vile Virgo. If you haven't already listened to part 1, why don't you pause and go back and listen? Don't worry, we'll wait. All right, welcome back. Awesome. So keep in mind as we continue our story on Ed Gein, just like what I did for Jeffrey Dahmer, this segment will not contain information on the sign of Virgo. Instead, we will continue to paint the background of Ed Gein's life. The astrology portion will return once we get into his birth chart in the final part of the series. And at this point, I'm not quite sure how many parts we're going to be doing because I'm trying to find natural breaks within his story so I can paint you guys the best possible picture. How's that for alliteration? Also, I guess I didn't really have a cold. It's more like allergy season with the fall and everything. And I feel like the older I get, the more susceptible I am to allergies. So I'm overcoming this slowly but surely, but again, I do apologize for any roughness or sniffling or anything like that you might hear in my voice. So, anywho, so if you've just listened to part 1, you will remember that we left off with the Gein family moving from La Crosse, Wisconsin to Plainfield, Wisconsin, located right in the middle of Wisconsin's sand country, also known as the cold, dead heart of Wisconsin. Mother Augusta is a dominating powerhouse and a force to be reckoned with, while George, the father, is a lazy drunkard who is a pathetic excuse of a man. Henry, the older brother, is now 12 years old, and little Eddie is 8. The year is 1914. The Geins have bought a 195-acre farm. In the early 1900s, owning property was almost entirely in the hands of men. But in this case, since George was proven to be such an idiot, land records showed that the land was actually deeded to Augusta. In the beginning, Augusta was happy with the homestead. She ran a tight ship and kept the house as neat as a pin. The farm was situated 6 miles away from the little village of Plainfield, which back in 1914 was a considerable distance. The nearest neighbors to the Geins were the Johnsons, who were just a quarter of a mile away down the road. Augusta didn't mind the extreme isolation. In fact, she grew to love it. She wanted to distance herself and the family from the sinful evils that were in town. Now, keep in mind, this is central Wisconsin. Plainfield and sinful, they really just don't mix. Her peculiar behavior in regard to this also meant that she was more or less shunned by the townsfolk of Plainfield. Just as well, though, she wanted nothing to do with the vice-prone community. Try as she might, though, Augusta couldn't keep her 2 sons completely isolated from the world. And when he was 8, Eddie began school at Rochacree, a classic one-room schoolhouse with about a dozen students in attendance altogether. Now, formal education back in the day really only went up to 8th grade, which is when Eddie graduated at the age of 16. It seems kind of old for an 8th grader. He wasn't a great student. In fact, he was unexceptional, as some books would say in regards to Eddie. But Eddie was an avid reader, and he enjoyed reading true crime magazines. His school years were not a particularly happy time for him, and much like Dahmer, he was alone and hopelessly cut off from his classmates. Granted, Eddie wasn't an alcoholic or the class clown like Dahmer was. The isolation was due in part to Augusta raising objections to any friend that Eddie would try to make. The few occasions where he seemed to be making a real connection with one of his peers, he would return home and excitedly tell his mother, who would promptly come up with a reason why he should not associate with that person. His father had a dark past, or his mother was of questionable virtues. Augusta would become so animated in her lecturing, her voice would rise into a scream. This made Eddie turn into a blubbering mess and retreat into his room. The next day, he would avoid even looking at the boy who he had hoped would become his friend, for fear of his mother's scornful scream. Even from a young age, Eddie's peers could tell that something just was a little bit off about the peculiar boy. On more than one occasion, a girl in class would turn around in her desk and catch Eddie staring at her with such an intensity that it would leave her feeling violated. Eddie didn't seem to be like other boys, though. Whenever he approached a group of young boys who were talking about sex, as youngsters are prone to do, he would overhear the conversation, blush furiously, and walk away as fast as he could. He also had different mannerisms. He had a soft voice, meek posture, and nervous, fluttering hands that made him appear girlish to his classmates. Eddie also had a fleshy growth on the corner of his left eyelid, and although it wasn't disfiguring, it did make his eyelid droop ever so slightly. One day a boy made a comment about it, and nothing particularly mean, just a slight joke about Eddie's saggy, baggy eye. But the comment immediately evaporated the half-side grin that was a constant on Eddie's face, and in front of the entire group, he erupted into sobs like an infant. The teasing from his classmates only helped to solidify his mother's opinion of the townsfolk. He believed that she was right about everything, and that the world was indeed a hard and wicked place. His life at home, though, wasn't much better. The farm they lived on barely produced enough food to provide for the family, and the fruitless struggle was a back-breaking job, especially since Eddie's father, George, was now completely unreliable to work. George was a full-time drunkard now, and although he would often beat the boys, now that Henry and Eddie were in their teens, they were too big to be beaten. This didn't stop George, though, from ranting and raving. During one such episode, he was so bold to accuse Augusta of adultery, which, considering how she viewed sex with such a vile guise, just proved how quickly George's mental state was deteriorating. In fact, Augusta was so against sex, even the idea of sexual relations, she made her boys swear to her that they would keep themselves uncontaminated by women. The Gein household was the perfect breeding ground for madness. On April 1st, 1940, George Gein died at the age of 66. The family didn't suffer the loss for any length of time, because George really wasn't good for anything. With him gone, it was one less person to take care of. The Geins still lived in the farmhouse, but for the many years that they had inhabited the place, they were never able to scrape together enough money to make any improvements. The house was void of electricity or indoor plumbing, and the gray paint was flaking outside, and the front steps were becoming splintered. The porch had even begun to sag, and the house that Augusta had once taken so much pride in was looking increasingly dilapidated. With the 1940s came the Second World War, and Eddie Gein was eligible for the draft. So in 1942, he traveled to Milwaukee for his physical exam. This would be the farthest away from home that he would ever go, and the only time he would ever really leave Plainfield. He was 36 at the time, and was rejected by the Army due to the fleshy growth on his left eyelid that ever so slightly impaired his vision. In an attempt to bring extra money into the household, Henry and Eddie would take odd jobs around the vicinity of Plainfield, patching roofs, painting houses, hanging windows. Eddie even did some babysitting. The kids were always happy to see Eddie. He would roughhouse with the boys and do simple magic tricks for the girls. He would even tell them scary stories of headhunters and cannibals that he would read from his adventure magazines. In the summer, Eddie would treat the kids to ice cream, and in the winter would join in their snowball fights. Seems a bit odd for a 36-year-old man to befriend so many kids, but Eddie was viewed as a class But Eddie was viewed as a town simpleton, a quirky yet harmless old man who just usually kept to himself. And he didn't really get along or relate well to people of his own age group. He always got along better with those younger than him. Henry Gein was considered to be the harder worker of the two brothers and was vastly more independent than Eddie would ever be. Henry began to take jobs farther away from home. One unique job that the book Deviant points out was that Henry was hired by a neighbor to act as a foreman overseeing a crew of Jamaican farm laborers in the middle of Wisconsin. Plainfield, Wisconsin, no less. What an odd combination of things to happen. Overall, though, the two brothers got along well enough. Eddie had a deep admiration for Henry. Of course, they had their share of arguments, and what siblings don't. Well, I mean, I wouldn't know personally because I'm an only child, but, I hear things. The biggest issue between the two brothers stemmed from, of course, their mother, Augusta. Henry had, on more than one occasion, pointed out that Eddie was overly attached to Mommy Dearest. Even though Henry never actually spoke disrespectfully of their mother, Eddie was shocked to hear this nonetheless. He had always believed that his brother held their mother in the same infallible view that he had. Augusta was a saint on earth, and to hear Henry's implied criticism came as a shock. Eddie couldn't begin to understand, and this was something that he would not soon forget. On May 16th, 1944, Henry Gein, age 43, was killed. Eddie and Henry were fighting a fire on some marshland near their home. According to some accounts, the fire had started accidentally, and in other accounts, it was started deliberately to burn off dry grass. Later, Eddie would say that it was actually Henry's idea to start the fire. And there are a lot of different accounts as to what prompted the fire and what actually happened. But the biggest question surrounding the whole ordeal is what exactly was the manner of Henry Gein's death? According to Eddie, a strong wind had picked up and the fire had gotten out of control. After he had managed to put it out, he returned to look for his brother, but darkness had fallen and he couldn't locate him. So Eddie went into town and got a search party going, and that included Deputy Sheriff Frank Engel, and somehow miraculously led the search party straight to the place where Henry was lying down, very obviously dead. As if that wasn't already suspicious enough, several odd things immediately stood out to the search party. First, even though Henry was laying down on a scorched piece of ground, there were no burn marks on him. His clothing was covered in soot, of course, but otherwise undamaged. Second, when the men bent over to take a closer look at Henry, they noticed what seemed to be bruises on his head. But the strangest bit of all was the fact that Eddie was able to lead the search party directly to where Henry's body was, after claiming he was unable to locate him earlier. When they mentioned this to Eddie, he just shrugged and agreed with them. Funny how that works. The county coroner was dispatched over to the scene and after investigating, determined that Henry had died due to asphyxiation, and that foul play did not enter into the equation of his death. Although the phrase Cain and Abel came to mind to a lot of the townsfolk, the matter was considered closed in the death of Henry Gein. Eddie wasn't too distraught over the matter though, because now it was just him and Mama. Shortly after Henry's death, though, Augusta had complained of feeling very sickly and needed a doctor. By the time he pulled up to the hospital in Wild Rose, Augusta was so weak that she had to be moved into a wheelchair into the examination room. Eddie was a nervous wreck. His mother was a figure of immeasurable strength and willpower, and there was no possible way that she could ever be sick. But when the doctor came out, he informed Eddie that his mother had suffered a stroke. Eddie never left her side while she was in the hospital, and when she was discharged, Eddie took her home, carried her inside, and laid her in her bed. She looked frail and ravaged, and Eddie was at a loss, having never seen his mother in such a state before. Now was his time to shine, because now Augusta was entirely in his care. He would have the chance to finally prove himself worthy, and perhaps she would even acknowledge his efforts. Eddie was the doting caretaker son. He waited on her every need. Augusta never complained, though. She just laid in bed and told him as best as she could what needed to be done. In mid-1945, Augusta had recovered enough to try walking again. Eddie stood near and offered a hand, but in her typical tyrannical fashion, shoved him off and said, "Move away, boy. I can manage myself," and struggled to her feet. She failed to acknowledge the care that he had provided during her recovery. Eddie wasn't too downtrodden, though. He was just happy to see Mama up and walking again. Because the Gein family farm still had some livestock, straw needed to be bought for fodder. So that winter in 1945, Eddie drove to a neighbor named Smith to arrange for a purchase, and Augusta accompanied him to oversee the transaction. Now, Smith was a mean man with a notoriously short temper. When the Geins drove into the yard, Smith was seen with a heavy stick beating a puppy. The puppy yelped in pain, and a woman who was living with Smith, out of wedlock, as Augusta pointed out, ran out and began screaming at him, trying to get him to stop. Well, the sadistic fuck that he was continued to beat the pup until it was dead, and the woman screamed and wept, yelling curses at him. Augusta was very shaken by the scene, but not by the sight of Smith beating the puppy, but by Smith's harlot. Again, let's remember that Augusta was fanatically religious and hated women, especially those who lived with men outside of marriage. Eddie would blame this encounter for Augusta's death. For not even a week after the incident, she suffered another stroke and was rushed back to the hospital. On December 29th, 1945, Augusta Gein, age 67, had died. The funeral, much like the funeral for his father and brother, were small and lightly attended. Eddie wept like a child because he had lost his only true friend and one true love, his mother. The sun had begun to set on his life, and the darkness slowly started to descend. And that is where we're going to stop on part 2 of Ed Gein Vile Virgo. We are really laying down the brickwork in the background for Eddie and his descent into madness. As always, if you like what you're hearing, please share Murder Is My Sign with anyone you can, any way that you can. You can find Murder Is My Sign anywhere you get your podcasts: Apple, Google, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favorite podcasting app. If you want to go above and beyond and support the show financially, you can buy your plot in the boneyard by becoming a patron at patreon.com/murderismysign, just like Jake, Michelle, and Crystal. Stay up to date on what's going on with Murder Is My Sign by following me on social media. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitch, all at Jordy Death. That's JORDY Death. Or if you're old school and want to email the show directly, you can do so at murderismysignpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you guys so much for supporting the show, and I'll catch you next week with the part 3 of Ed Gein Vile Virgo. Until then, take care of yourself and each other, and rest in peace.